Ja, hallo, herzlich willkommen zu unserer Diskussion, in der es um die wirtschaftlichen Folgen des Krieges gehen soll. I will switch to English now because we just agreed on this common language here on the panel. 2-3 words about myself, because in the booklet there's a bit outdated information. I've been living in Moscow. My name is Katharina WAGNER. I've been living in Moscow since 2014 and working as economic correspondent of a German newspaper, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, since 2019. This year, our newspaper decided to call us back in the beginning of March to Berlin because of the new law imposing prison penalty for fake news about the Russian army. So we're now reporting from Berlin, but hoping to go back to Moscow in August. So we have Valeria GONTAREVA, but there she is. She's joining us from London via Zoom. Mrs. GONTAREVA was the governor of the National Bank of Ukraine from 2014 until 2017 under President Poroshenko. And she's now working as visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics. Live with us here is Angelina DAVYDOVA. She's a journalist, a Russian journalist who has specialized on climate and environmental issues, and who has also left Russia in March and is currently living in Berlin. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Petr ZAHRADNÍK. He's an economic analyst and specialist on EU policy and development, economic policy of the EU. So we will now be discussing the economic consequences of the war of Russia's war against Ukraine. And our main question is what happens after the isolation from Russia? Does it mean that European countries who have partly become very dependent on Russia in the past, especially Germany, does it mean that because of the economic consequences of this dissolution from Russia, European Union might fall apart, or the unity of European Union suffers because of the economic consequences? Or can we even find the possibility of more unity in Europe because of the possibility of including Ukraine in Europe? This is our main question, and I'd like to start with Valeria. My first question to you is, sorry, I just have to find it here. Oh, I forgot to say, we have about 50 minutes, just like in the first podium. After that, we will open the discussion again. Also online, you can also take part and ask questions. Mrs. GONTAREVA, there's a debate starting, fueled by French President Emmanuel Macron, who said the West shouldn't humiliate Vladimir Putin. This debate this comment was interpreted as a call for ceasefire or maybe peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, which would actually mean that Ukraine loses a big part of its territory, because Russia already controls about 20% right now of Ukrainian territory, which is actually where the steel and coal industry is based, in the Donbass. So my question is, could Ukraine economically survive without the Donbass, without the eastern territories? And how much has the war already affected Ukrainian economy?
First of all, good morning, everybody. I apologize that I could not join you physically, and I'm with you through Zoom. And of course, I'm very happy to be with you and answer all your questions. And of course, right now we have a lot of questions, not just this one. That's why maybe we will start from the beginning, from the war of 2014, when Ukraine lost 10% of our territory. 20% of our GDP, and I will not count anymore all our disasters and perfect storm which we experienced in 2014, 2015. But because it was very weak response from all international community towards Putin's appetite. He started, and Putin's regime started this war again. That's why I think that any insinuation about let's help Putin to save face, I think it's absolutely not acceptable. And I'm absolutely happy that yesterday Mr. Macron, Mr. Scholz, Mr. Draghi, and also President of Romania, four presidents, prime minister and presidents were in Kiev yesterday, and their communication after their meeting was absolutely clear. No any pressure for Ukraine to save face to Putin. And it's the first very good statement from their side. And the second one, it's Ukraine will be as a part of Europe, and very soon we will be a candidate to European Union. That's why very, very good news from yesterday. In the same time, your second question was about how we will survive without some part of our metallurgy, some part of our Donbass. But again, I'd like to remind you about our war in 2014, when we lost in one day 10% of our territory. It was eastern part of Donbass. That's why we are talking right now about additional eastern part of Donbass. It's not like we will lose all Donbass. But because it's a full-fledged war with tanks, missiles, absolutely incredible crimes, war crimes, of course, right now we will maybe we will lose about 50% of GDP. That time we lost 20% of GDP. But again, in 3 years' time, we stabilize our economic situation. Macroeconomic stability was our priority. When I was a governor of the central bank, if we'd like to discuss how we do that, we will. But in the same time, you know, Ukraine economy is quite diversified. That's why I'm not worried about Ukrainian economy. I am worried about war, about really bloody war. We need to stop it.
But how, if we already look into the future, I mean, the war is unfortunately maybe going to last for a long time, but how can Ukraine be rebuilt? I mean, with respect to Europe, how can the West extend trade with Ukraine? And maybe also when we look at the present situation, how can they try to ensure wheat exports from Ukraine under the condition of war? How can this, well, the connection to Ukraine be intensified with Europe economically?
First of all, we need to, I said that we need to stop a war. We need to concentrate all our efforts to stop a war. And yesterday was not just a visit of 4 leaders to Kiev. Yesterday also was a Rammstein meeting. And when all, you know, international community decided how they will support us with really strong weapons. And that's why I have no doubt that we will end this war to the end of this year. Right now, we have a very strong support from all international community. You know that our budget deficit, it's about $5 billion per month, and we get all international support from all international donors. That's why I'm absolutely sure that they will support us to the end of this war. End of this war will be end of this year. And after we will start very massive recovery plan. We'll call this plan Marshall Plan, but it's a different one, because Marshall Plan was how US help European countries with all this Second World War. In the same time, right now, it's opposite situation. It's how all countries, civilized countries of the world, will help Ukraine. That's why I have no doubt, and we're already in the preparation phase of this Marshall Plan. That's why we will even see, you know, very quite not just we rebuild better, and it will be even better country as a part of Europe.
Thank you. Petr ZAHRADNÍK, when we talk about Europe trying to help Ukraine and even about granting candidate status, which might be recommended by EU Commission today. This is one side, but on the other side, we already see EU members like Hungary pulling out of the consensus because they don't want or are not able to live without Russian oil. How big is the risk for the EU to not fall apart, but to lose its unity?
Thank you very much for your interesting question, and thank you very much for being invited to this extraordinary, important and interesting conference. I think that the consensus on the independence on Russian oil and gas or strategic raw materials is one of the key issue of the current days and weeks. Quite generally, the European Union has shown, I would say, unprecedented solidarity to speak one voice regarding the, let's say, strategic dependence on Russia. But on the other hand, this unprecedented solidarity is still not enough to not only to stop the war, but also to make a visible damage to the Russian economy in the short run. Currently, it's under discussion the document called Repower EU, which is just the, I would say, official European Commission proposal regarding the limitation of the EU dependence on Russia in the key three strategic raw materials as the inputs for the European Union economies: coal, oil and gas. Regarding the coal, there is a consensus. In fact, the autonomy is already the reality. Regarding the oil, the reality will be provided in practice until the end of this year. Regarding gas, the situation is, I would say, much more complicated because due to the different energy mix in different European Union countries, there are some of them who are really strongly dependent on the imports of the Russian gas. By the way, the European Commission for this purpose released a table or a metrics of the most vulnerable countries regarding the energy, trade and assets due to the situation after the Russian aggression to Ukraine. And in the top 10 countries who are the most vulnerable, 9 of them are countries of Central and Eastern Europe. So it's really a hard issue for them. But on the other hand, regarding the gas, of course, you already mentioned Hungary, which is not very happy with the currently proposed concepts, but there are some other countries, for example, Netherlands, which economy is very strongly based on gas. Not only the economy itself, but also the energy system. Netherlands has a very high ratio of renewables in the economy and society, but most of them are dependent on the previous usage of gas, mostly imported from Russia. So it's a very, I would say, complex situation. The limiting or stopping the dependence on the Russian imports of raw materials is based on several, I would say, robust investments necessary to provide as soon as possible. First of all, it's a territorial reallocation of the sources. The economic theory call it as import substitution, simply to substitute as much as possible the volume of imported gas from Russia by the other sources from the Gulf. There are strong negotiations, for example, with Qatar. There are some other countries, the United States, some Latin American countries, and also countries in North Africa. The second way is to invest into new sources of energy, usually hydrogen and biomethane, with our own capacities in the European Union, but it's not necessary to provide it until tomorrow. It will leave, even with absolutely unprecedented investments, at least 2 or 3 years. Then it's a issue of interconnection, because big vulnerability of the energy system of the European Union now consists in the fact that some countries or some territories are totally isolated from the rest. Spain and Portugal, for example, from France, and let's say Central European countries, the same the Baltic countries, and the interconnection with the core of Europe, etc. And the interconnection is really very, 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 very important to improve. And the last part, higher investments into renewables and the measures on energy efficiency. The problem of the consensus is, as I mentioned, that the energy mix and the progress in different countries is very very different, and it will be very, I would say, hard test of European cohesion regarding the final content of the Repower EU. But there is no doubt that some effort in this direction is absolutely fatal and necessary.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just a quick second question to you, because you mentioned also that some of the the countries that are suffering actually from getting independent from Russia are Central and Eastern European countries, but still they are also the ones who are faster than others getting rid of Russian gas, like Poland and Bulgaria. How can you explain that? I mean, are they more ready than Germany to suffer economically, or do they not suffer that much?
I think all this story is about the diversification of sources. For example, countries like France and Finland, who have very high ratio of nuclear energy, combined with a very high ratio of renewables, especially for Finland, the gas story is not a case almost. Of course, it's in relative terms, it influences somehow the country. For France, in some aspects as well, I would say one of the indicators how sensitive the issue is for the particular country is the current rate of inflation in these countries, because the inflation mostly is a reflection of very negative expectations regarding the future prices of energy sources. And both Finnish as well as French inflation rates are very below the European Union average, to use the concrete figures. Both are in the values between 4 and 5% year on year. The average of the European Union now is close to 9. And for example, my country, Czech Republic, has the rate of inflation over 16%, the third highest in the European Union after Estonia and Latvia. So back to your question, there are some also previous agreements. For example, the previous pre-war situation led to the contracts between Hungary and Russia at very advantageous prices for Hungary, which allows the country also to use this strategic source at very, I would say, appropriate and favorable price. But the situation is very different. You mentioned also Poland. I know that we are also in the period of implementation of Green Deal strategy focused on the very ambitious green targets. But for example, Poland is a country, also my country is the other example, who has, and it's not an autonomous case in Europe, huge stock of coal and lignite. So in the very, I would say, critical situation, those countries can, I would say, activize and utilize the capacities in the coal energy sector. They have not only the stocks, but they have also the infrastructure and also the workers still with some ability to be engaged in this sector. The same Bulgaria is also a country with not let's say excessive, but some stocks of those very key raw materials. But I'm a strong supporter of the Green Deal, but in case we are living in extraordinary period, and for this purpose, at least as a, I would say, emergency or crisis instrument, those sources, I think, could be utilized in practice as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So if I understand, if I may summarize a little bit, you don't see the big risk of Europe falling apart in this crisis. I mean, the risk is there, but as you mentioned, there is a lot of resources and possibilities to, yeah.
Of course, but very, very important, I would say, parameter is time. Yesterday, we have heard extremely interesting lecture and presentation on the time aspect of the story. There was also talked about eternity, but eternity is not the parameter of the issue we are solving now. The Green Deal, as a very ambitious policy, has two, I would say, sub-targets, 2030 and 2050. And the current situation even much more accelerates this target. The Repower EU talks about well before 2030. So all these investments that could be under, let's say, peaceful condition distributed in 10 or 30 years now, we have to do in perhaps 5 years. And it requires enormous demand on sources and also enormous demand on the consensus you've mentioned in your question.
Mm-hmm. Angelina, there's another very big risk arising from the fact that the West is isolating Russia, and Russia, of course, is isolating itself politically from the West, and that is that Russia loses the incentive of to care about climate change. Because before, when there were Western companies in the country and the trade was happening, of course, they had to follow Western standards in some parts, at least, of the economy. Now, Russia has decided to produce cars with very low ecological standards because they lack important details that are not brought to Russia anymore. What does the war mean for climate change and for the environmental policy of the West? And what can the West do to not lose Russia in this global task?
Wow, that's a really big topic, and there are quite a lot of questions. I'll try to address them precisely and quite shortly. So indeed, as you mentioned, the ongoing war and also the following sanctions and embargoes on fossil fuels coming out of Russia, as well as voluntary sanctions or self-sanctions of many foreign companies living in Russia, they do leave a very important trace on Russia's environmental and climate policy. It's all very recent, I should say. It's only 3 months that we are experiencing that. However, there are already a number of trends one can speak of. I'll probably take a step back and I'll give a very brief overview of what Russia's climate policy was before the war. One should also mention Russia is the world's 4th or 5th largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Whether it depends on whether we count European Union as one entity or not one entity. And its emissions have been falling throughout the 90s and 2000s, as well as with many other Eastern European countries. And then they've been on a very slow rise in the last year. Russia is a party to the Paris Agreement. And Russia has its own climate goal by 2030. However, this goal is not very ambitious. In fact, it's very ambitious, and even if Russia's forests and forest sequestration capacities are taken into account, that actually might even mean Russia emissions can go up under its current climate target. On the other hand, as someone who's been following this topic for the last 12 years, I would say there was indeed a shift in Russian climate policy and attitude towards climate rhetoric in Russian political agenda, business agenda, and also societal agenda in the last 2 or 3 years. This is also the years when Russia has adopted its first climate legislation, including the long-term low-carbon development strategy, which appeared last year, shortly before the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow. Russia has adopted its first regulation on large companies and large polluters to report on greenhouse gas emissions, which was not the case. And likewise, Russia started working in the area of climate adaptation, and the first national climate adaptation plan appeared. Now, that was all very new. And that was all happening to a number of reasons. One of the reasons was, as you mentioned, the foreign or more likely the Western influence. It was very much connected with the plans of the Green Deal, also a colleague of mine has mentioned, and more specifically, plans to introduce the so-called CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will make many of the goods and coming from Russia to the European Union much more expensive. In its first stage, I mean, the CBAM is still not introduced and it's still being discussed. In the first stage of the CBAM, it was supposed that the metals, fertilizers, and a number of other goods will come under this regulation. And that was a huge wake-up call for Russia's business community. They're the ones who started worrying about climate regulation in Russia. They're the ones who started worrying about building their own renewable capacities. They're the ones who started worrying about planting trees or reporting on their carbon emissions. And we saw this trend coming in the last 2 years. Now, another move and another motivation for the climate agenda in Russia, and I would also probably speak from my expert capacity as someone who's been watching very closely and also covering this topic for Russian and for international media, I would say was the fact that Russia was viewing these topics as relatively neutral, also in international relations. And in many ways, we're trying to show that we are open for the so-called green diplomacy. I think we already started seeing it in as early as September 2014, shortly after the annexation of Crimea. And that happened during the New York Climate Summit. This is when Russia came forward and say, we're open for everything. We're open for international cooperation. We're for green agenda. We're for climate cooperation. And also outside Russia and within Russia, I think it was very much perceived as, even if Russia's relations with the West are somewhat difficult on other positions, we can still do something with regard to green and climate agenda. Now, what's happening now and what has been happening in the last 3 months with regard to green and climate agenda. Officially, it remains high in political agenda. Actually, as we speak now, there is an ongoing St. Petersburg Economic Forum taking place in St. Petersburg. This is a city where I also come from and the city which I left in mid-March. And interestingly, the forum is still taking place. It used to be called an international. It's still called international. Now it's exactly now it's the Taliban who are represented at the forum, among with many other non-Western or not the so-called unfriendly countries, as the many Western countries are being described now in Russia. And surprisingly, there are still quite a lot of green panels at the forum. I was actually following the discussions, and I was following what is being said. Local environmental agenda, including the waste reform, remains to be high priority, but also questions of what happens further on with climate agenda, what happens further on with ESG questions for businesses. They're all still present. So I think the current level of understanding is it remains in the political agenda as the topic, but then we have to look beyond it. We really have to see what is being done and not what is being said. And if we look at what is being done, we see quite a lot of negative trends. On one hand, quite a number of environmental legislation has been rolled back. For example, everything connected with the introduction of the so-called best available technologies. This is about polluting industries and polluting substances, so not greenhouse gases, but polluting substances. So the whole reform has been pushed back again, including real-time monitoring of polluted substances coming from large enterprises. You've already mentioned the new regulation for the cars being produced in Russia, going really down to the Euro 0 standard, which is like 13 years before what Russia had, so like rolling back. A lot of complication for environmental expertise, both state environmental expertise and civil society environmental expertise, so civil society, civil environmental expertise, a lot of limitations. Then lexing out a lot of rules on new construction, including construction in nature protected zones. This is also all happening. Now, those are environmental consequences. If we speak about more about the climate targets and climate agenda, as I said, they were already not very ambitious in the beginning, but then now officially they still remain the same, but there are a lot of talks and actually a lot of push from businesses and from companies to review low carbon development strategy, to review climate targets, and also to review emission obligations and verification of emissions by large companies. And I would probably finish with one very practical example, which might also be interesting, I think, also for a general economic picture. With Russia isolating itself and with Russia, with new sanctions and embargoes being introduced, even though Russia looks at other markets to sell its products to, including China, including India, and including many other countries, what we currently see in the country, and I think it's, once again, it's very interesting from an economic point of view, is the abundance of certain resources. Russia gets too many resources which it cannot sell at the moment. And there is already an abundance of oil and not enough facilities to store this oil and to process this oil. And so it leads to the fact that oil companies push now for the power sector to take more heavy oil for energy generation and switch some natural gas power stations back to heavy oil, which is obviously a very bad story for climate and for environment. Likewise, flaring gas. Flaring gas is a natural gas which comes together with oil extraction, and Russia has been burning it for many years. Then there was a lot of investment done, and also on the side of the World Bank in Russia, and many Russian oil companies actually started capturing it and then processing it into petrochemicals, into kind of plastics, and selling it to the European Union. Now this track is also closed, so Russian oil companies are pushing again for the flaring gas to be burned again. And this is once again a very bad story for local environmental conditions in the region, but also for the global climate story. This story is the same with quite a number of metals, interestingly. For example, Russian Ministry of Construction has recently introduced new regulation of more metals to be used in construction because there's an abundance of metals in the country. And to say completely like last thought and to bring a completely last fact to this discussion, I would also mention the forestry sector. You are indeed right saying that many international certification agencies have withdrawn from Russia, including the FSC, Forest Certification Council. And also quite a number of large timber companies, international timber companies, who have been buying forest products from Russia, including Stora Enso from Finland, for example. They said they will not be doing so anymore. So where does it lead us to? China is willing to buy more. Many other countries in Asia are willing to buy more, but then do they really need certification of origin of the forestry? Do they really need certification and proof of sustainable forestry policy? That's an open question. And that obviously is it's quite bad news for Russian forestry sector, for its sequestration capacities, also connected with the current forest fires, which are already very fierce this year. And unfortunately, it's also very bad news for the global climate picture.
Thank you. And very interesting that you said that the abundance of resources in Russia and the possibility to sell it just to other buyers in Asia leads me to the next question. Isn't it very comfortable actually for Russia to just switch, well, to switch to the east and to find new buyers who are not interested in any certificates and environmental protection? So my question is, what does this isolation from the West mean for Russia's economy for the future? Because right now many are disappointed by the sanctions not working as much as many hoped for so far. And the fear is, of course, that they can just, find new partners in the East.
Well, I would say there are a number of answers to this question, and I would probably start with an answer to a question: what has been an impact of sanctions so far? If we take a look at the character of the sanctions, we will see that the first tranches of the sanctions, they mostly targeted financial sector. And with reaction to this, Russian Central Bank and many other financial institutions have somewhat been rather successful in dealing with the sanctions for the financial sector. Now, since a while, we also see a new wave on sanctions, which come and which tackle industrial sectors, which tackle technological sectors. Those will have a prolonged effect. Those will not come into power straight away, not with the financial markets or Russian banks being excluded from the SWIFT system, for example. Those we will see at least in September or later this year coming into power. And we will actually see huge gaps in supply chains, also for Russian-based productions. We'll see some increase in unemployment in Russia. We see many companies stopping their production. There are already quite a lot of the ones who are withdrawing from Russia as part of self-sanctioning, but it will also, in the end, influence Russian economic sector and many sectors of Russian economy. The economy of Russia is not only about extracting resources and selling it, even though it's a big sector. For the economy to function within itself as a country, one also needs to sustain local production and local consumption. And a very good example here, I think, is the agricultural sector. A lot has been said about how Russia can self-sustain itself with its own agricultural production. And indeed, since 2014 and the counter-sanctions, which Russia actually imposed following the Western sanctions, we did see some development of Russian agricultural sector. However, we cannot fully say that Russian agricultural sector is fully independent from the Western investment in Western technologies. For example, food for animals or medication for animals, or also the special eggs which they used in egg production, and also all the technologies connected with it. Most of them are coming from the Western countries. And the question is now, what will happen to this sector? I mean, here, once again, there are various talks, including the so-called parallel import. So unofficial imports of coming to Russia, but through other countries. And when this is being discussed, quite a number of countries are coming into question, countries from Turkey to, I think, some countries in the South Caucasus. So that could be a way. And then could China provide some of the technologies? Possibly, yes. Would China be interested in more intense cooperation and economic cooperation with Russia? This is, once again, a very open question. On one hand, China is certainly interested in buying more resources from Russia, but under lower prices. That has already been the case with oil. China has been buying more Russian oil in the last 3 months, but the price, even though we don't have official statistics for these prices, but the price is what we know is at least 20 to 25% lower from what Russia used to be selling its oil to Western countries before the war. Likewise with wood products and forestry, likewise with metals. There will be a demand in China for this. But the really big question, would China be interested in other kind of economic cooperation? China has not been investing in Russia, like almost nothing. China has not been an investor. Likewise, China is also very much aware of the global economic and political situation and probably will not want to be seen as the savior of Russian economy in current conditions. So I would say it's more complicated. It also varies according to the sector. It also sometimes varies according to infrastructure. Does actually Russia has enough infrastructure to export many of the products of which we're discussing to Asia? There are most pipelines already working under their full capacity. Pipelines need time to be built. Likewise, oil transportation needs more tankers. Likewise, more railroad transportation on the way to China, which is also located quite far away from the centers of Russian economic activity. So those are all open questions, I would say.
Thank you. Before we start to open the discussion, one more question to you, Valeria. We already mentioned the process of Ukraine applying for candidacy in the European Union, and you sounded quite optimistic also. Of course, in this debate, there's a big elephant in the room, which is corruption in Ukraine. Which is a big problem. And you have kind of personal experience with the power of oligarchs in Ukraine, because when you were governor of the central bank, you nationalized the biggest bank of Ukraine, Privatbank, which was formerly owned by oligarch Igor Kolomoisky. And after that, you have said you received many threats by him, and your house in Kiev was burnt. The car of your daughter-in-law was burnt. You were hit by a car in London. This, of course, sounds very terrible and reminds me of Russia. I would like to know, what is the role of the oligarchs today? Has the war changed anything about their weight in Kiev? And maybe the second question is Ukraine ready to become a member of European Union with regard to reforms and corruption?
Thank you for your question. First of all, of course, I'd like to have some reflection for previous discussion about climate change. And you know that right now, whole world really concentrates their efforts for existential problems. Existential problems right now, it's a peace in European continent. And I think it's absolutely crucial, and everybody really concentrate their efforts. But a good for all of us, you remember that European Commission recognized nuclear energy like a green one. Sorry. And this, and you know that maybe Ukraine, during the peaceful time when Putin's regime will be defeated, could be a real hub for nuclear energy for Europe and France as well. That's why I think that Ukraine will be absolutely great, not just a candidate, but a part of Europe for our green solutions in nearest future. And about your question, you're absolutely right, what's happened with me, because when we start our reforms in 2014, 2015, it was absolutely a perfect storm, as I mentioned, because it was really a problematic situation in the banking sector. We clean up Ukrainian banking sector from zombie banks, from money laundering machine, and from oligarch banks. And one of biggest Ukrainian bank, Privatbank, was nationalized in 2016. And after, it was absolutely incredible pressure. I call it sustained harassment. That's why my contract, like a governor of central bank, was for 7 years, but I put my resignation letter in 3 years because of real death threats. And after you mentioned what happened 2 years later, even with me personally and with my family. But to do reforms, it's not necessarily to be afraid of any oligarchs. And when Ukraine right now committed to be part of European Union, it means that rule of law should be a priority for Ukraine. And I absolutely agree with you that the status of candidate, it's not a status of member country. And we need to do our homework in Ukraine and accelerate all our efforts to introduce real rule of law, real reform of all judicial sector, court system, and all of that. That's why no doubt about that. We need to do that. It's homework for Ukrainian government and for Ukrainian president right now.
Are there already questions here from the audience? If not, then we will just continue. And if there are any questions.